Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second of our series that we've called the Scholars in Psychological Sciences lecture. So we run this as an annual event each year, and this is the second year it's been run. It's part of the University of Tasmania's Island of Public Talk series, and we'll feature a talk tonight called Parenting in an Unsteady World. I'm Professor Lisa Foer. I'm Head of School of Psychological Sciences, and so I'll be your host for this evening, and welcome everybody. It's lovely to see a great crowd, and thank you all for coming out on a Wednesday night. As we turn to tonight's proceedings, I would first like to acknowledge on behalf of the University the deep history and culture of this place. Today we are broadcasting from our Sandy Bay campus in Nipaluna, Hobart. This is the traditional and original home of the Muanina people, who are tragically no longer with us. But the Palawa Pakana people are thriving, and I pay my deep respects to their reinvigoration of their language, and the work that they've done to save their culture and language is quite incredible. From the oldest continuing culture, they would have gathered beneath our mountain kunani, sharing advice on parenting and hopes for future of their young people as we do today. Hopes that colonisation took from them. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and those who were forcibly removed from these lands and did not make elder status. We stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language and history, and continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights. In our school in psychology, we are trying to recognise the power of Aboriginal knowledges and slowly learning how to incorporate some of that knowledge into our learning and teaching. The science of psychology for us is embedded in Western traditions. So it's an exciting time for us if you stop and consider that for tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal people cared for each other, clearly knew about behaviour and decision making and mental health and how to deal with all of that. And we know that psychological processes also have an important part or a powerful part to play in the way we develop our conscious and unconscious biases and our racist attitudes. So our mission in our school is to learn from our past and to learn from the elders and to share knowledge to create a more inclusive community. The Island of Ideas public talk series began in 2020 as a way of connecting our community with ideas and innovation when we couldn't meet face to face. We continue to broadcast these events around the world and hope that we can connect ideas and people of Lutruwita to a global network of collaborators who wish to co-create a better future. Sharing knowledge is an important part of our culture, and tonight's no exception. So as we gather to celebrate great and emerging scholars in psychology. The School of Psychological Sciences has a strong history at the university, having been taught here since 1902. The Department of Psychology established in the 1950s, in the early 50s. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Melanie Zimmer-Gembeck. And tonight's conversation that Melanie's going to bring couldn't be more timely or important for our community. Melanie's originally from the US, currently at Griffith University, where she's the Director of the Family Interaction Program and leads a newly established Griffith Centre for Mental Health. She's a member of the Menzies Health Institute of Queensland and co-leader of the Dynamics in Youth Development Research Group. She conducts research on important times of life for the development of interpersonal problems and psychopathology, as well as for mental health, growth, resilience and recovery, working with children, teenagers, young adults, families and peer groups. Her research concentrates on the impact of social relationships, online and offline, and the development of coping, emotional regulation, rejection, sensitivity, and other social cognitive beliefs. She also concentrates on some of the major concerns of adolescence: appearance, social media, and immersion in technology, virtual worlds, parents and friends. I'm sure all of you can relate to those topics. As someone who's a mother of two teenage girls, I can. Having published almost 300 publications in books, book chapters, journal articles, supervised more than 40 candidates, PhD candidates, she's a true collaborator, research award winner and scholar in psychological sciences. So to deliver Parenting in an Unsteady World, please provide a warm welcome to Professor Melanie Zimmer-Gembeck.
So I first want to say I'm really thrilled to be here. I am going to talk about parenting in an unsteady world, and I'm going to address new challenges for parents and parent support programs. I just want to briefly also acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and pay my respects. Tonight what I'm going to talk about I'm going to weave through a few topics. So I want to start off by just talking about thriving, resilience, and adaptation in parents and children. And then I'm going to go through 5 challenges that I wanted to address through research and what we're doing in parenting support programs at Griffith. I can't really actually see that, so I'm going to look here. I want to talk about 3 research challenges, parents, and the development of children's coping. And I'll tell you more about that in a moment. The complexity of parenting. I want to then weave into talking about systemic burdens on parents and the pressures parents face in today's world. Before I weave over and talk a little bit more about parenting support programs and the family interaction program that you heard mentioned just a few minutes ago. And there I want to really focus on a couple of really difficult challenges in that space, which is reach and engagement and retention of parents in support programs and really having an impact. And the second one is around addressing diversity in parents and children within our programs. And then I'm going to quickly do some concluding comments because I'm sure I'm going to be out of time, so I'll be racing, and sorry about that if I am talking really fast at the end. So tonight, I want to focus on the role of stress, parenting, and emotion in parenting and in children's development. And I want to do that by focusing on a few ideas. The first thing I want to focus on is identifying why do we do this work, and that's to support children to thrive and to support parents to support children to thrive. But if anybody works in this area, you're working in mental health, you know that thriving is defined in many, many different ways, and I define it in many, many different ways in my work. It can be avoiding mental health problems and psychopathology. It can be being generally happy and making good choices in your life. Many people argue that it's not so much about happiness, but it's about finding meaning in your life and identity and values that you subscribe to. For me also, as someone who's very interested in social development, I focus on developing social emotional skills and how we can help children have good friends and develop good relationships outside the home. And so all of this is about thriving. And that makes this area of research really, really complex and not something I can cover in a 50-minute talk at all. But that's the whole purpose of the work that I do and so many other people do, is trying to help children to thrive. And there's many bodies of research that contribute to this work, not only what I'm going to talk about tonight. The second thing I want to just emphasize before I move into talking more about parenting is resilience and its core to thriving. Many of you, I'm sure, will have heard the word resilience over and over, and you're probably tired of hearing that word. People use it for everything nowadays. To be resilient is, the ultimate goal for everyone. And it is true still in developmental science that we really do focus on trying to understand resilience in young people and foster it through parenting programs and understand it through our work. But it means something really specific in the work that I do, and it's defined as doing well or recovering better than others following difficulties like stressful life events or daily hassles. So key to resilience is really adapting to stressful events. And that's why I said at the beginning I was going to talk about stress and coping in children and parents. Because as Anne Maston says, resilience is really closely tied to adaptation. She defines it as the capacity of a dynamic system to adapt successfully to challenges that threaten the function, survival, or future development of the system. So our research, then the research I do and the research of so many, focuses on how social relationships and other contexts can give children the best skills to adapt, to improve then their chances for resilience and their chances to thrive. And I think what's important about this is that these adaptive skills that parents are charged with providing for their children or helping them to develop not only is directly relevant to their adaptation, but it gives children the skills then to drive their own development into the future, to drive their own positive development once they have those skills. Also, before I go on and talk more specifically about parenting, the parent-child relationship is the social relationship that's really important to children's adaptation and resilience and thriving. And of course, I'm going to focus on that tonight, but I do just want to take a moment to acknowledge the many layers of contributors to the development of adaptation and resilience and thriving across the lifespan. And in our work, and you'll probably know that this is often classified into 3 categories of contributors. The first contributor is genetics and characteristics or attributes of the child. So of course, children come with genetic predispositions. They have certain traits that will drive their own adaptation and their resilience and their thriving. Things like their temperament, their sociability, their soothability. It can be their set point of their stress reactivity. It can be their emotional reactivity at birth and their regulation abilities. It can be general intelligence. So we all know there are many, many contributors to child and youth adaptation, resilience, and thriving that exist within the child themselves, child attributes. And then the second big category is the family. So parents, many argue, are the most important contributor here, the most important external influence in children's lives, especially in the early years. I'm sure many of you have heard about the first 3 years of life and how important parents are to that. But I just wanted to also acknowledge the fact that parents are not on their own in the family. There are siblings, and there is the interparental relationship, and there are often grandparents or extended family that also contribute. And I'm going to be kind of leaving them out of this talk tonight, but I did want to acknowledge that. And then there's the third huge influence, which is external, all the rest of the external environment, the social environment that a child is residing in that contributes to their adaptation, resilience, and thriving. I personally started out actually studying peer relationships more than parent relationships, and I think peer relationships are a huge contributor to this that we don't often study enough, and looking at the positive impact of peers. We also have activities and community and culture and the nation you live in. All of these things are contributors to children's development. And I want to mention all that because I didn't want anyone leaving here tonight thinking that parents are the only thing that I think influences children's development. And sometimes I really do not believe that parents are the most important influence in some cases. All of these things contribute. One last thing before we move into parenting I want to raise is how I think about adaptation. So in a number of books and in a current handbook that we just published a couple of months ago, we have really identified and referred to coping as a process of adaptation. Coping defined as a fundamental adaptive process that is important for resilience and thriving. So taking it to another level of complexity, adaptation is, of course, really closely linked with coping with stress. Coping is the adaptive process that people use to deal with the challenges and the problems they encounter in their everyday lives. It's the way that we protect ourselves from the ravages of stress. It's what contributes to resilience and thriving, and it builds resources for dealing with future challenges. So it's a developmental process itself, experiencing stressful events and having to cope through them, as long as they're not too overwhelming, not too challenging, within your realm of management, are actually developmental for you. And so coping is a sign of also development, in my view. So what do I mean by coping here? For those of you who might study stress and coping or be familiar with the stress and coping literature, you might be thinking of all the ways that people cope with stress, like problem solving, support seeking, avoiding. If you're stressed, you avoid, dealing with it. You might withdraw from social relationships if you're distressed. And these are coping strategies, and I do study those things in my work. I study specific coping strategies and the resilience connected with them, and whether they have implications for development. But the theoretical work and the reviews I'm showing you here, as well as many other papers, we've tried to highlight that in that work, it's really that those coping strategies that we're studying in kids and in parents are simply just actions on the ground that are representative of a bigger adaptive process. And what we really need to do is understand this process because it's really complex. It involves many, many parts and many, many levels of the human system. So stressful events and the responses we make to them, the adaptive responses, or what we would call the coping responses, really involve neurophysiological systems. They involve the emotion system. They involve the appraisals that you're making, the cognitions that you have in a stressful event. They involve your attention. Are you going to orient towards, or are you going to orient away? And of course, all of that is embedded within the stressor itself and what's happening, who's around you that can support you, is it a place of safety for you or not? So all of this contributes to coping. And in the work that we've been doing, we've been trying to think about how development of all of those parts are critical to understanding adaptation in children and then across the lifespan. And not only is it the parts that are important, it's the whole organization of that system that we're interested in understanding as adaptation, as developmental outcome. Now, in our work, in our research, that's really hard to capture, and we really don't do a very good job of it. So the writing that we do around chapters and integrative work is really trying to draw from so many different researchers. So Ellen Skinner, who's my big collaborator in this space, and I wrote a book or a chapter called We Need a Bigger Boat, because we really need to understand all of the work going on across all those different areas to really integrate it together to understand any one social influence on adaptation. Just to understand parenting, we need to know what are parents impacting on, and it's that organization and all of those levels of the human system. So this is where parenting comes in. Coping with stress, as we define it as adaptation, is very deeply social and contextual. When we're focused on children's development, younger children in particular, but all the way up, I think, throughout into early adulthood, even beyond, we can't ignore the role of parents as socializers and foundations for development across all these levels of the human system I just mentioned. So they're critical in so many ways to adaptation, resilience, and thriving into the future. This brings me to the first new challenge. We really do need more research to really understand parents' role in children's development of coping. Our challenge is unpacking parents' role in all of those different levels of the human system as parts of an adaptive process to understand the organism as it moves forward through life. Much of my work has concentrated on this. I focus mostly, though, on emotional stress responding, so the emotion side of responses that young people make to stressors, and then also focusing on social emotional outcomes for children up through young adults in my work. And always trying to think about coping or other measures that I'm using as part of the coping system and adaptation. So let's talk about parenting for a minute. That's also another complex topic. And just to understand parenting as a social foundation for coping and resilience, we also have to expend a great deal of effort trying to think, what does it mean when you say parenting? What does it really mean? What is parenting? And generally, of course, people define it as caring for children, helping them grow and learn. But there's so many things that children are growing through and learning, which I've just mentioned. And so parenting is also quite diverse and complex. And this has really been reflected in the way that we study parenting and the impact of parenting on children's development. We've tended to think about it in many different ways. If you go into the literature on parenting, you'll see, quite simply, positive stuff and negative stuff. So you're going to see studies of positive parenting practices and their impact on children, negative parenting practices and their impact on children. And that's the simple view, that there's positive stuff and there's negative stuff that you can do. If you delve in a bit deeper, you're going to find it's really quite a puzzle to look at the research on parenting. There are many different ways that we define what's positive parenting practice and what's a negative parenting practice. So on the left for you, positive. I'm just mentioning a few here. There's going to be literature on warm parenting, involved parenting, sensitive parenting. You go to the attachment letter, security. You're going to see, can't read it, mindful parenting, autonomy supportive parenting, just to name a few. On the right-hand side, negative parenting, coercive parenting, hostile parenting, over-involved parenting, helicopter parenting, a newer one. You've got abusive parents, neglectful parents. All of these bodies of research sort of are separated and study parenting in isolation from each other. Some of them overlap, but it means we have different aspects of parenting people study across different areas. They sometimes overlap, they sometimes don't. We have multiple measures of all of these different ways of parenting, and we really don't have a good understanding of what's most important here or what's the best. And then, of course, we have the whole layer of different ages of children, from infants up to young adults, and some of these parenting practices are designed to be relevant at a particular age, might have more or less impact at different ages. So it's quite a complex area. Not only that, but it is huge. So the parenting research field is huge, it's ginormous, it's monstrous, and this is why I put, this is the new challenge in quotes back a few slides, is that it's not new either. We've been studying this for a long time. If you go back to the 1940s, you can find similar ways of thinking about parenting and parenting practices and looking at their impact on children's development. So we have massive amount of work on parenting, looking at all kinds of different areas of thriving and all the different levels of the human system that's been existing for decades. But I will argue here that we still need more research. We really are moving forward in this work now because the world is always changing. And we have new ways of thinking about what's important in parenting. We understand parenting differently. We expect different things from parents. But what also is great about all this research is it's accumulated so much that we also have excellent ways to support parents, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. So I would also argue that these many, many areas of research and these many decades of studies have been critical for us to really understand what to do to support a parent when they're struggling. It's taken that long for us to feel confident in what we can do. So I'm going to move into I'm not going to provide a whole bunch of research findings here, but I did want to just mention a couple of studies to give you an illustration of some of the work that I've been doing in this space. So this study with the aim of, has been, most of my work has had the aim of understanding parenting or other social influences on children's coping and responding to stress. And so I've been doing this work probably for about 15 years, I would say, focused on parenting in particular, but other social influences for longer than that. So let me just present to you one very kind of straightforward study that we did about 10 years ago, which was simply looking at the influence or the association of negative parenting on young teens, in this case, depressive symptoms and social anxiety symptoms. What is important here is that we were testing a latent variable structure equation model, and it's more complicated, and I'll get to that in a moment. So negative parenting was modeled here as indicated by a number of different negative parenting constructs: rejection by parents, coercion by parents, psychological control, which is usually defined as kind of manipulation tactics that parents might use to get compliance from their children, like withdrawing love, I won't love you if you don't do this, or inducing guilt. And then low warmth and low autonomy support. And what I wanted to just highlight here is that, yes, we find associations between negative parenting and more symptoms in young teens. So the two paths here in the model, you can see two things: larger for depressive symptoms, kind of moderate in size, but quite small for social anxiety symptoms. And this is illustrative of the area more generally, that we tend to find, small to medium effects between parenting and mental health outcomes in young people. So this is, straightforward, loads of studies that have done things like this, But what was really newer in this study was that idea of trying to look at adaptation, stress adaptation as a mediator, linking parenting practices to symptom outcomes in young teens. So the model was more complicated in that we included a number of different mediators here, including how sensitive the teen is to rejection experiences in their life, something else I studied quite a lot, trying to understand those individuals who tend to overinterpret ambiguous events as rejections. Also looking at sad reactions to stressful events. These are specifically social stressors from peers. So kids who overreacted with more sadness when they felt stressed, and then young teens who withdrew from threatening events were more at risk. So all of these were associated with negative parenting and served to somewhat or fully mediate the links between parenting and mental health outcomes. So the idea here is that how young people respond to stress was an outcome of having negative experiences like coercion, like rejection at home. Then when they have stressful events with peers, they react more negatively, which in turn relates to their development of symptoms. So this illustrates just kind of a broad focus across many studies that I've done with my colleagues and students in the lab, looking at parenting associated with a host of outcomes for young people, children all the way up to young adults, as mediated by stress-related mechanisms. So trying to use that as an explanation for why parenting does lead to positive or negative outcomes. We've done cross-sectional studies, longitudinal studies, some experimental studies. We've focused on particular links shown here, not sometimes the whole model. We've also tested more complicated models. And I've really spent a lot of time trying to unpack that middle portion, the mechanism portion of this model, trying to really understand stress-related, what stress-related mechanisms are important here in these associations. Generally finding that yes, this model is helps to explain why parenting, especially negative parenting, might relate to outcomes, especially negative outcomes. So we've studied, so here's some of the mechanisms. We've studied appraisals of stress. We've studied ways of coping. We've examined emotion regulation and emotion dysregulation. We've studied stress reactivity, threat perception, etc. We've studied self-compassion. I think of self-compassion as a really interesting and important coping mechanism, and then rumination, and a host of other things. So those are just a few examples. But generally finding that this model is supported across, and then feedback loops as well. So how mental health then feeds back into potentially your perceptions of the parenting you're receiving, as well as the ways you cope with stress into the future. We've examined a number of different parenting practices in models like this, and I'm just naming a few here, but we've looked at both positive and negative, and a range of positive and negative outcomes, depression and anxiety, aggressive behavior, loneliness, a whole area of work on appearance and body image, which is another area that I've concentrated on, and then also tried to examine more positive outcomes. So can positive parenting improve the way that you cope with stressors, which in turn helps you develop better relationships and be more satisfied with your life as a child, adolescent, or young adult. So this brings me to the second challenge that I wanted to highlight. In these studies, you may have noticed that we tend to focus on just one area or a couple of areas of parenting and calling them parenting practices. So we might study one negative practice and positive practice, and they're very much in isolation of each other. And this is not necessarily wrong. It's one way that we do study parenting in this work. But it really does raise a challenge. Again, another new challenge in quotes, that we are really not tapping into the complexity of what it's like to really be a parent, of kids who at different ages. We really need more work to capture that complexity. And especially this is where my title of the presentation came from, in an unsteady and risky world, parents are really challenged sometimes to balance the positive practices that they're told they should be engaging in with the other behaviors that might be more controlling to protect your children from risks. So parenting is not so simplistic as it's negative or positive. It really isn't. And our studies, we try to reflect that, but it's very difficult. Again, I put new challenge in parentheses or in quotes because this is not new. Everyone will be familiar with Diana Baumrein's theory, probably from the 60s, where she examined parenting styles by combining two dimensions really, responsiveness in parents and demandingness in parents. The authoritative parenting style everyone will be familiar with, that's supposedly high in responsiveness, high in demandingness, contrasted with permissive and uninvolved or authoritarian parents. And so this illustrates the second challenge that people in this area have really tried to confront, which is how do we reflect the complexity of parenting in our studies? And I think this has really brought me to a point of thinking that we really do need to go back to consider this work again. Like I'm not just saying take Baumrein's work and let's use it because everybody still does that, but it's really more about thinking about contemporary parents, starting from scratch, thinking about what is the combination of parenting practices that might be best for children at different ages in contemporary world where you've got competing social media pressures and all kinds of other things going on in the home. And parents don't have as much real control over the home environment as they used to. So as researchers and idea generators, I think we really need to start focusing on a greater range of parenting behaviors in our work and try to think about different forms of parenting other than just responsiveness and demandingness in these kind of analyses. And I think we also need to acknowledge that sometimes parenting styles, I don't even want to call them parenting styles necessarily, but sometimes what you might find in a family that's going on sits really outside of any of these quadrants. So in the work that we're doing with, abusive or neglectful parents, of course, they don't fall into any of these quadrants really. They're far outside of the levels that we see here. So in our work, we've been trying to do that a little bit with Unsteady. I just want to mention with a PhD student right now, Sarah Howe, where we have been examining maternal emotion socialization practices. These are moms' responses to children's negative emotions. So they're given vignettes about when their child has a negative emotion, sadness, worry, anger, how would they respond? And we measure their positive responses, so they use problem-focused strategies or emotion-focused strategies are expected to be good things like helping the child to manage the emotion, helping the child to problem solve why they might feel that way, or the third, encouraging their child to express their emotions. And then we also measure 3 negative emotion socialization practices, punitively responding to emotion, so getting upset that your child's upset, for example, or punishing in some way. Getting emotional when your child is emotional, so getting upset that your child's upset, or minimizing. So you don't feel that way. No, you don't feel that way. Let's move on. What we've done is we weren't necessarily interested in any one of those practices and its association with children's outcomes. In this case, these were children 6 to 9, so younger children, and we were examining their own emotion dysregulation, their social anxiety symptoms, and their depressive symptoms. And we found, yes, just like Baumrein found, parents fell into 4 categories. If you threw all of those 6 measures into a profile analysis, we got 4 clusters, 4 groups. Coaching accepting mothers, so this is about 30% of mothers. They were high on the positive responses to negative emotion in their children, low on the negative. And then another 16% of mothers were the opposite of that. But 15% were low involved, so similar to Baumrein's kind of uninvolved, parents who didn't really say they did much of that, anything when their child was upset. And then the biggest group was the blended group, mothers who said they did all of those 6 things at a moderate level, similar to Baumrein's responsiveness and demandingness. It's not like you're high responsive and high demanding, you're moderate on both. And here, mothers, majority, the biggest group of mothers, I shouldn't say majority, the biggest group were blended. So then we didn't know what to anticipate when we compared these groups on children's dysregulation and symptoms. But what we found when we measured these outcomes in the children, the blended mothers had children who were lowest in dysregulation and lowest in symptoms, followed by the coaching accepting group, which would be the group that probably most people would anticipate would have the best impact on their children, and then the low involved group. And there really wasn't much difference between the coaching accepting group and the low involved. The low involved, I think children were scored poorer on one measure, and then the punishing, minimizing, which you would anticipate. So the blended group had the children who were functioning best. I think what's important here is that we also controlled for gender and age and temperament of the child, because most people would think, well, maybe they had easier children or children were less likely to be negative. We didn't find that. We also found no association between these profiles and children's temperament. And I think it's reflective of what's going on in the literature, and thinking about the ways that parents are responding is about their child is stressed, they're stressed, and they're actually modeling and engaging in a range of different strategies with their children in a range of different contexts, where sometimes minimization is important and best, and sometimes it's not. And so parents who are blended, recognizing context and its influence, they are also probably modeling a bunch of different strategies for their child that is beneficial to them in the long run. Children, actually, I just written a paper about peer relationships. You know, in peer relationships, children need to learn when to not display their emotions with their peers, because their peers can take advantage of that, and it cannot be, the best for their social development and their friendship development. So they may be learning some of these skills from a blended mother. So I think this is important to take away, because different than the messages you might get from the internet about what's the best way to parent, I don't think that always holds up in our research. Sometimes a variety is good, and parents are dealing with kids in very different contexts, and they can't always be stopping to help them express their emotions. Sometimes other strategies are better at that moment. So those are the first two challenges. The third challenge moves us into sort of a different level: systemic pressures and burdens on parents. This is really where the title of my presentation came from, Parenting in an Unsteady World. I think in the work that we do in the working with parents in parenting support programs, which I'll talk about right after this, it's become really clear that housing issues, issues of poverty, unstable work for families, domestic violence that we hear about on the news, substance use, limited opportunities, is really causing quite a bit of distress among a lot of parents and making parenting just a harder job. And so I'm not doing as much work, and I haven't done as much work in this area, but I have been approaching it with a similar focus and trying to do some reviews of the literature and thinking about parenting and the pressures on parents. So basically building on the same model that we've been doing to look at the effects of parenting on children's development, we've been trying to test out looking at the impact of pressures on parents and trying to really understand how stress and coping and emotional responding in both the parent and the child kind of infiltrate into the family system and make the whole family system unstable. And understanding all that, I think, is what's really important now for parenting support programs, because it's critical to understand all that. So if I go back to just the first model I showed you with negative parenting in young teens, the one path I didn't show you was the whopping association between interparental conflict and negative parenting. So by quite a distance, the strongest association here. So the pressure that impacts on negative parenting can be quite strong. And I've got my latest Australian Research Council grant is actually specifically focusing on pressures that parents are facing and its impact on parenting. And in this research, we're focusing specifically on overparenting, which is defined as excessive involvement. And in this case, we're studying older teens because it's often considered something that's important to understand in older teens, where parents might be doing everything for their teen, they're over-involved, they're really concerned about risk, they're monitoring extensively, and the idea is that can be detrimental to young teens' self-regulation and their own development into the future. The evidence is, I think, a little bit mixed about that, but that's what this grant is focused on. But the big core thing, as well as focusing on why are parents overparenting, trying to think it's not parents' fault that they're overparenting. They're overparenting because of the pressures that they're facing and the risks they see in their environment. So this is just, we're kind of only launching into this grant. We're kind of halfway through it. So this is preliminary findings, so just correlations. But this shows the correlations between, let me go back to that, societal pressures, so pressures that parents perceive they get from society, from other parents, and from the media to be perfect, for your child to be perfect, and all correlated with then their over-involvement as a parent. And look at the whopping correlation with social media pressure. So parents who are reporting that they experience a lot of doubts about their parenting and a lot of pressure from social media to be better, to be positive, to be the best, are the ones who are reporting more overparenting. And then we also find some correlations with job demands and financial instability, and a whole host of other things I'm not showing here that reflect risk perception about risks in the world, and so all kinds of different societal levels of pressures impacting on overparenting, as well as parent burnout and parent anxiety. So let me turn to support programs for the last little bit. What's really been fortunate, all of this research that we've done and so many other people have done has been translated into parenting programs, so parenting support programs. It's allowed us to develop programs based on the research findings, to test them, to disseminate them, to improve them based on new findings, and it's also led there to be many programs available in Australia. So here's just a list of the programs that are available for parents in Australia. There's more that I probably put on this list that I'm not aware of or I just missed. Parent-child interaction therapy, parent-child care, which is a short version of PCIT. Triple P, many of you will have heard of Triple P, Circle of Security, another program. Tuning Into Kids, which is a program out of Victoria, etc. There's Parent Helpline now in every state. The federal government gives quite a bit of money to the Parenting Research Center and the Raising Children's Network to provide all kinds of online resources and materials for parents. So there is a lot of support out there, and some of it's free. I think everybody knows Triple P is available free online now to any parent. I think they received, I don't know, millions of dollars to do that. Victoria now is providing a free online program for families that fall in the middle range, that are not really child safety or high risk, but they need a little bit more than Triple P online. They've just committed quite a bit of funding there. So lots of funding is going towards parenting, especially coming out of COVID. And in the program that I direct, we do 4 of these programs. We provide parent-child interaction therapy, parent-child care, the shorter version, Circle of Security, and a program called ROAR, which is a program for older children to up to kind of 13, 14 years of age who don't have a parent in their life. So the program is designed to help them figure out how they can deal with their own stressors in their life without parent support or any caregiver support. No stable adult in their life. The program is called the Family Interaction Program. Much of our work is really focused on parenting, supporting parents, develop the parents' own resilience and coping and adaptation so they can support their children's coping and adaptation. It's really designed to improve mental and social health. And I think what's been wonderful for me getting to work in this space and direct this program has been that a lot of my basic work that I've described here briefly has come out of the work that we've done in the Family Interaction Program. So we've seen more than 1,000 families in the years that we've been going, and it's very intensive work. So I've seen about 50,000 sessions with families go through our clinic. We almost always record the sessions, so we have so much observational data that I'll never be able to look at. And so it's really influenced my thinking around studying parenting. And this is where we've had the opportunity to sort of directly assist parents and translate our work. So we provide parenting programs to families who have many challenges. So we were funded in 2003 and established in the psychology clinic at Griffith University to do parent-child interaction therapy specifically. This grew out of a call from the Queensland Department of Child Safety for what they called future directions trials. So they were actually asking for people to do randomized controlled trials of parent support programs to keep families out of the child safety system. So they were referring those who had a notification before they were actually verified or got into the system. And so we were funded to conduct an RCT of parent-child interaction therapy. And it was a 1 year. We were probably going to get to see about 10 families in that time, I imagine. But we have been lucky to continually be funded now for 22 years. So we are now funded till 2025. So they've funded us to continue to do research, really, as well as provide a service. So they've allowed us to always doing randomized controlled trials or rigorous studies of some sort, cohort studies. We've tried modifications and enhancements to PCIT. We've also done trials of circle of security. We've really been able to do a lot of applied work, given that funding and the support from child safety. It's also been wonderful because we are a place for post-grad training because we're in the clinic. We have so many clinical students that have come through our programs who are trained in the programs, get to provide them, even if they're not doing their research on it, but they get to see how to use research in practice. So then they are able to go out into their own practice and collect data to inform their own practice and improve on it. So it's been critical for training clinician practitioners, really, a lot of them master's students, some PhDs. And we are now very connected to the community. So let me just go through what parent-child interaction therapy is. I'm not going to spend more than about 2 minutes on this because there's a lot of detail I can't cover. It is a program for children aged 2 to 6 years, sometimes up to 7, depending on developmental level. It was designed for children with significant behavior problems, disruptive behavior problems, kids who can't stay in school, teachers don't want them in the classroom, really aggressive at school, can't get along with their peers. And it also, of course, parents are very distressed when that's happening in their home. So it also focuses very much on reducing parents' distress. That was the original design. It's since been now modified and used in many, many different forms of difficulties in children and for many different parenting issues. It is a program that has 2 didactic teaching sessions and then 12 in vivo coaching sessions. So it runs across 2 phases. The first phase is we call relationship enhancement because the focus is really on developing a close, positive relationship between the parent and the child. In the literature, it's called child-directed interaction because the child directs the interactions. And then the second phase is additional skills or parent-directed interaction, where the parent then takes control once the relationship has been enhanced. So the 2 didactic teaching sessions there's one at the beginning of each phase, and each other session includes direct coaching of the parent with interacting with their child during play. So as you can see in this picture, a therapist is in one room, child and parent in the other room. They're wearing an earpiece, and the therapist is coaching the parent all the way through the session, coaching the parent through play, what to say, how to interact with the child. So just really quickly, it's a very interactive program. The child gets to direct the play at first, and the parent's learning how to use pride skills, which is praising and reflecting and imitating, etc. It's about learning how to ignore bad behavior as much as you can, so not reward it. A lot of coaching around avoiding hostility and managing your anger when your child gets upset. And it's very attachment-based in that the parent and the therapist are really working together. The therapist has to help the parent to feel safe and secure. At the same time, the parent's helping the child to feel more safe and secure in that interaction. So it's a very intensive program. We've done, like I said, multiple RCTs and cohort studies. We've found overall that PCIT is effective across a range of different outcomes for both parents and children, with medium to large effects. And I think one thing I just want to emphasize before I move on to the last little points is that if you look in the literature, there's very few parenting programs out there that have any evidence that they are effective at reducing abuse and neglect. And this PCIT is one of the only programs that has that evidence, and it's really come from our lab as well as some other labs. So it's really, the work we've done has really built the literature around PCIT, and now there are so many studies out there looking at PCIT and how to modify it and make it the best they can. So we have, I'm really running out of time, so I'm going to hurry. The problem with it, though, like any program, is that retention. So I will skip this, but I just want to raise the point. The fourth challenge I wanted to raise in this talk is that we still have problems with retention. We have problems with retention in parenting programs. We have problems with retention in child and adolescent mental health interventions generally. And I think the next step we need to take in our research is really trying to find ways to maintain, to attract families in and help them stay in the program to completion, because so many do drop out. And it's a real problem that we have in the field. And so we've been working on that, trying all kinds of strategies. And then the last point I just wanted to raise as a challenge is addressing diversity. And I think the reason I wanted to raise this at the end is that I think it's one way that we can actually attract families to the programs and maintain them, is to make sure that we're addressing the diversity of needs that families present with, and really understanding how to do that well. So, I think one of the really, really exciting things is that we now have 40 years of research on parenting support and what works and what doesn't work. And I think now we're moving into what I'm calling a post-effectiveness research phase, where the goal is really to now tweak the programs to get them to be just right for the families that need it, for the diverse families that we're seeing in the clinic. So really to improve the relevance of the program. That's the future of research, I think, in parenting support and in a lot of mental health intervention areas. So to conclude briefly, I think I wanted to leave you with 4 main points. Parenting has far-reaching effects on children because it's such a source of modeling, support, and socialization of children's adaptation across many different levels. And it's really linked to the development of coping with stress, which we all confront frequently. And there are many ways to do good parenting, and we need to understand that better in our research and not assume that there's one good way to parent, and that a priority needs to be reducing pressures and demands and stress on parents so that they can do the best they can. Parents struggle also with adaptation because of the stressors that they're under, and they really do need support. And our programs can do that as long as we can reach and engage them. And I wanted to end on a positive note that we can really celebrate that there are so many parenting support programs out there with years of evidence of their effectiveness that are available across Australia. So keep that in mind if you run into a family who might need a referral. Thank you very much. This is just a list of all the people involved in the work, and also some information to contact me or to go to the websites if you're more interested in more information. Thank you.
We have a few minutes left for time for a couple of questions.
Thanks for a great talk. I'm really curious about whether there are international differences between these parenting studies, perhaps in countries that have more governmental or societal support for parents versus low support countries?
That's a really good question. I think what I've noticed, I think, in being in countries where they do have a lot of support, for example, Switzerland and Sweden, they don't seem to be as concerned about it. They do feel like there's more support. So I don't feel like there's as many support programs available. There aren't as many studies on parenting support programs coming out of those countries, but they do also study. I think one thing I've noticed is that they do study sometimes different parenting practices that they seem problematic. So the colleagues that I'm collaborating with on the over-involved parenting side are from Belgium and Switzerland, because that's where they're very concerned about over-parenting more than in countries like here and in the US, where they're more worried about neglectful parenting or abusive parenting. So I think there are concerns about parenting that differ by different countries. And I also think that in some countries like Japan and China, where they haven't really had a focus at all on trying to help parents parent, they're now starting to become aware that when they're seeing problems in adolescence now, they're becoming aware and are really starting to support more parenting support programs. There's more research coming out of those areas. So there's clearly differences in what people are worried about in the parenting space, but every country has concerns in some way, I think. And then there's very differences in how they approach it in providing parenting support, whether they're focused on, they can focus on different programs, but they can also focus on where they're going to put their money. Like, are they going to reduce the pressures by providing more, overall support for stay-at-home and maternity leave and all of that? Or are they going to actually put their money into actual intervention later when things are starting to go wrong? So I think there's a lot of diversity.
Any other questions from the audience?
Thank you, Professor Zimmer-Gembeck. I'm not a parent myself, and often when I think about this issue, my point of reference is Andrew Solomon's book, Far from the Tree. You're probably aware of it,
Yep.
Looking at interactions between parents and children with very complex needs. And I was wondering whether in your research you'd looked at the impact or evaluated the impact of interventions on particular segments of the parenting or family market, if I can put it that way, parents with very exceptional challenges, and how effective the interventions are there.
Yeah, that's a really good question, I think, because we've just written a review trying to consolidate all the research on PCIT that's been done, because what's happening in just parent-child interaction therapy, there's probably been about 100 studies in the last 15 years or so that are sort of trying to address that, but they tend to, they'll focus on parents with a child who's on the autism spectrum, or parents who have autism themselves, so there's a lot of piecemeal stuff out there, and a lot of holes still in what we know. But in general, I think you can say that a program like parent-child interaction therapy, because it's so one-on-one and can be so modifiable in the precise things that you do. Like, there's basic core principles in which you operate in PCIT, but you can modify depending on the parent's skill level and their ability to understand what you're asking them to do, and then you can modify how the child reacts. And there's a lot of awareness of trauma versus behavior problems. Where's the behavior coming from? And if it's a child on the autism spectrum, you might interpret their behavior differently than you would if it was a child with ADHD. So you really need a very trained practitioner, but that's possible to do in PCIT. So overall, the research is showing that PCIT is effective with all of the groups that have been studied. The effect sizes can vary. I think it works best for what it was originally designed for, which was children with disruptive behaviors. Could be ADHD, might not be. But it's also been quite effective with kids with anxiety disorders. But you do need to change it. You need to, of course, you're not going to be using you don't need some of this, you don't need the skills as a parent when you have a child with anxiety disorder. You're not trying to down-regulate their negative emotionality. You're trying to draw them out and give them confidence through challenges. So the strategies might change, but overall, it seems to be effective. I do think there's mixed. In the literature right now, there's sort of a mix of conclusions, though, about should we do programs as they were originally designed, or should we modify? Some reviewers have concluded modifying is better. Others have concluded not modifying is better. So I feel like I need to do more of a deep dive to really understand why are different people writing different papers coming to different conclusions, because there's something, messy there that we're not picking up on. So at the moment, it's kind of the jury's out on whether, to modify or not. But I think that's, we do know that PCIT in particular is helpful for most parents and most children that it's been studied with. Yeah.
I might just finish off with, there's a couple of questions online and they're both about ADHD.
Uh-oh.
So the first one, I'm going to do them roundabout, but one's about, has any of your research aimed to establish if there are different outcomes for children with ADHD or parents or children with, children of parents with ADHD?
I haven't actually, so in the basic research I've done, I haven't actually focused on children with ADHD, so I don't know like long-term outcomes for those children. But I do know in the parent support program literature that some of these programs are actually have better outcomes for children and parents when the child has ADHD, and even if they have symptoms. So if they have disruptive behavior, but they're not scoring high on symptoms of ADHD, or they don't have a diagnosis, the effect sizes are strong. A little bit better if they have ADHD symptomology, and even better if they have an ADHD diagnosis. So I think it's not going to cure the ADHD, but it can help the child to learn strategies to regulate, and the parent to learn strategies to support their child to regulate when they need to.
Yeah. And the last question, I've been told we're wrapping up, but the last question was about funding, which is something that you and I can't control, but it's never, NDIS and so on. It's even parents who have ability to support children and get them therapy, actually finding those services is ridiculous.
Yeah, I think that's, I hope my microphone's on. That's, I'm not an expert on NDIS because I'm not a clinical psychologist, so I actually don't have to work through that system, luckily. But I think that waiting lists are huge. We've had to shut our waiting list just in our program, and because we've had, we can have waiting lists of 100 children with lengths of time of a year. So we've shut, and we just see we make sure that families have actually accessed online resources first, free services online first. So we have a tiered system of then how do you get on the waiting list to keep it lower. But I know all the services on the Gold Coast, the Southeast Queensland area are 1 year, 2 year waits.
Yeah, it's appalling.
It's and it's not even so much, it's funding, but it's also trained practitioners. We have shortages there, so.
Yeah. We're working on that. Okay, I'll stop now. We could talk about this all night, but I'm conscious that it is after 7:30, and I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight and giving up your time to come and listen. Congratulate our students and listen to Melanie. That was a really fantastic talk, and
thank you.
Actually really reassuring as a parent to know that, blended is okay, people. So what I'm taking home from that.
You're taking that away.
No, thank you so much. That was
Thank
great.
you all for coming.